Hello Guyana and welcome to The Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you very much for joining us this week. Of course, with me is the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, His Excellency Brigadier David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
Today we're also joined by three journalists. Of course, Ms. Radha Motilal from the National Communications Network, NCN, Ms. Kiana Wildberg from Kaitro News, and Mr. Travis Chase from Nightly News. On today's program, we're discussing the importance of inclusive governance and social cohesion to our country. Let's get right into it. Brigadier Granger, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. In the past, even before being elected to higher office, you would have complained about the challenges that you would have faced as a then opposition leader, of course, in terms of inclusive governance and achieving social cohesion in Guyana. Now that you're president, do you expect to face some of those same challenges?
Not really. I've already met with opposition leader Mr. Bharat Jagdeo. I couldn't meet him before he was elected, but once he's elected, I wrote right away to him, inviting him to start our engagement, and happily he came along. There were several items on the agenda, and most important, he did commit himself and his party unequivocally to support Guyana's position on the territorial controversy with Venezuela. There are other issues on the table, but he wants to regulate the engagement at his own pace. He has to brief his party members. So it's early days yet. I do expect that, and I've already warned the Minister of Finance that in preparation for the 2016 budget, there must be consultation, bipartisan consultation, with the PPP, so that we agree on a budget which does not have the sort of car crashes we had between 2012 and 2014. And I expect this will be done. Right now, the process has started, and Mr. Jagdeo, I'm convinced, once he briefs his party members, will be prepared to continue the process. So I don't regard it as a challenge, I regard it as an important opportunity to go forward towards 2020.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll now give the other members of the panel an opportunity to pose their own questions, beginning with Mr. Travis Chase from Nightly News.
Thank you, Malika. Mr. President, on the issue of social cohesion, current initiatives by the Ministry of Social Cohesion are encouraging, but most Guyanese, particularly the grassroots folks who are the majority, are heavily influenced by relatives abroad. What measures are being contemplated or taken to bring to bear the important influence from the diaspora on this important issue of national cohesion?
We cannot change the diaspora, but we are depending on grassroots education. And we feel that a lot more has to be done. For example, as you know, I announced 2 days ago that the indigenous languages will be given a central place in our education system. Dictionaries are to be produced, and I expect that later this year we will establish something called a Public Service Staff College. Public servants will be required to familiarize themselves with some aspects of indigenous language. That is part of our cohesion, the education system. Unfortunately, the diaspora can't be involved in that. We need to reduce poverty, because once you have a society with extremes of, some people are extremely rich, some people are extremely poor, it is difficult to build cohesion. We also have to encourage the political dialogue, and that is one of the reasons why I was so interested in meeting the leader of the opposition, because the political engagement is an important part of social cohesion. These are some of the activities which the diaspora may not be fully familiar with, or may not be fully supportive of. But I want to assure the diaspora that processes are taking place in Guyana which are going to produce a more cohesive society. Up to the 2000s, you remember, we had some terrible spates of criminal violence, and we don't want to see that happen again. And we're looking to education, we're looking to poverty alleviation, we're looking to political engagements in order to reduce inequalities and embrace more Guyanese in the political system. Don't forget that our constitution, at Article 13, prescribes inclusionary democracy. So all that I'm doing is a fulfillment of the constitution. And the diaspora, I hope, would understand this and be more supportive of the measures which are taking place on the ground here in Guyana.
Kiana, you now have an opportunity to pose your question.
Thank you. Mr. President, there have been complaints about the behavior of parliamentarians on both sides of the House during the debates on the budget and throughout the deliberations. I would like to know, do you have any intentions, or does your government have any intentions on taking social cohesive efforts at the level of the Parliament?
The answer is yes. We feel that the present administration is in the forefront of a new political culture. In any parliament, anywhere in the world, there will always be some good-natured banter. But we must be careful not to allow that good-natured banter to degenerate into insulting language. And I have briefed the Chief Whip, and I will discuss this with the Prime Minister as well, who's leader of the House, to make sure that the banter doesn't degenerate into vulgarity. We had problems in the 10th Parliament, as you know. In fact, one parliamentarian resigned as a result of some remarks which were directed towards him, and I hope that doesn't happen again. So I think we must be prepared for some type of exchange, but it shouldn't degenerate into vulgarity. So both the Prime Minister and the Chief Whip will be informed about this. We have a new political culture, and there is no place for that type of antipathy in our new culture. At the same time, it's not always, hugs and kisses, but we want to make sure that there is robust debate, but in a respectful manner.
Radha Motilal from the National Communications Network.
Thank you, Malaika. Mr. President, on the issue of inclusionary democracy, you met with the opposition leader, which is basically also the PPP leader. Could you explain for the nation of the benefit, because there is that concern that the smaller parties within the coalition have very little to no say. How does inclusionary democracy work within the coalition now that you're in government?
Well, all 6 parties are represented not only in Parliament but also in the Cabinet. All 6 parties are members of some are cabinet members and some are non-cabinet ministers. So all 6 parties hold ministries. So there is a level of inclusivity among them. My concern is that the 6 parties now should have an engagement with the PPP so that we really have a multi-party approach. All parties represent in the National Assembly must participate in the government, not necessarily the cabinet level, but by a bipartisan process. And this is what we see starting. We've started with the border issue, with the Venezuelan controversy. I have had discussions with the Minister of Finance to establish a bipartisan budget committee so that the 2016 budget will be representative of the views and interests of both the PPP and the coalition. And then there are other areas we like to cooperate on. For example, we like to cooperate on agricultural issues, particularly sugar and rice. We like to cooperate on crime. And most of all, we like to cooperate on forging national unity through the process of civil cohesion. That all of us, whether we are in the political parties, we're in non-governmental organizations, we're in the trade unions, we're in private sector, we have an obligation to build better relations rather than practice the adversarial relations which got us into trouble between 2002 2008 and which got us into trouble before you were born in the 1960s, what we call the disturbances. We don't need to go back to those days. We want in May next year to celebrate our 50th anniversary in an atmosphere of, I would say, unity, national unity. And I'm confident that the dialogue with the PPP will move into new areas. It's early days yet, and I would like the former President, Mr. Bharat Jagdeo, to engage his own PPP Central Committee And he will regulate the dialogue, in his own time and his own pace. So I'm very confident that by next year, things will be moving much faster, much further.
Since we have some more time to discuss inclusive governance and social cohesion before we move on to other possible matters, I'd like to give any journalists who may want to ask a follow-up.
I'll take one. When the APNU AFC were in the opposition, they used the term shared governance as opposed to the PPP using the term inclusive governance. Has that whole idea of shared governance been dropped altogether, or is there a possibility that we can see this inclusionary governance going into an area of shared governance?
Well, we have had a pretty long wait, an abnormal wait for the PPP to take up its seats. So even though we had written the PPP on certain matters before, their absence from Parliament really prevented the process from moving forward faster. So it is only when the PPP entered Parliament and a leader of the opposition was elected that I had somebody to speak with. I couldn't speak to Mr. Ramatari, he was no longer there, and Mr. Roy was just the General Secretary. The party actually has no leader, but now we have a leader of the opposition. I think you can see the process moving forward. As far as shared governance is concerned, the PPP, when it was in government, did put out a document, and the party may want to look at that document again. But we have a whole raft of issues before us because as a leader of the opposition, there's a constitutional obligation for me to consult him on certain appointments. I would like PPP to have positions on various boards, agencies and commissions, and I think that's the form it will take. I have already proposed some bipartisan committees, but it's up to the PPP now. So we are moving ahead, and we don't want to rush the process. But it depends on what the other side calls shared governance. There is a committee on our side, a 7-member committee, which will engage the PPP anywhere, anytime, on any matter.
Your Excellency, if no other journalists,
Yes.
you have a question on inclusive
Mr. President,
governance?
on the issue of inclusive governance, how is it that you're going to achieve this when politicians are continually in campaign mode and the administration's failure is seen as the opposition's success?
Well, this is something that we're working at. There will always be differences, but what we don't want is, antagonistic differences. We don't want the differences to degenerate into violence and disorder. So it depends on what the two sides want. So I can't predict how all of the dialogue will take. For example, the budget, even though the opposition is invited to share in planning the budget, there will be some aspects they don't agree with. I mean, it might be something like the bridge, or maybe poverty alleviation, or subsidy to sugar industry. There's no way that we will agree on every single measure, but we don't want that disagreement to degenerate into antagonism. That's the problem. So there will always be opposition. We need opposition. We need people, on all sides, in the business community, non-governmental organizations, who will point out, about treatment of women, maybe treatment of the poor, relations with Venezuela. But those differences must not degenerate into antagonism. That's my view.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now we'll move on as we do. We do have to move on from inclusive governance and social cohesion. I'd like to invite the members of the media to post questions they desire to have His Excellency respond. And I'll begin with you, Ms. Kiana Wilberg from Kaitru News, as I said before.
Thank you, Malaika. Mr. President, there are perceptions within various quarters that your government may be slow to hauling in the big fishes, so to speak, of the underworld. What is your reaction to these perceptions out there?
There are two sides of the coin. One, were we to dismiss persons from the public service, or were we to haul in people from on the world we consider to be big fishes, people say, where's the evidence? And sometimes the evidence is not there to see, and we have to do proper investigations, and that is what is being done. So we don't want to just haul in people for the sake of making the headlines. We are trying to accumulate evidence, and obviously crooks and criminals will want to cover their tracks and cover cover the evidence, and this is what we're trying to unearth. It's only been 100 days, and some of this criminality has been going on for 20 years. So some of the birds may have flown, some of the big fishes may have swum away. But we are doing our work. As you know, some committees have been established, and Professor Clive Thomas himself is looking into what we call asset recovery. So it will take a bit of time, and we are confident at the end of it we'll find out where the state property is. As they say, the old dogs know where the bones are buried in the yard.
Malaika, if you can permit me,
Yes,
one quick follow-up.
I can.
You mentioned just a moment ago that perhaps some of the birds flew away. Does your government intend to partner with the international community in terms of, if you find that a crime has been committed 2-3 years ago and this person is in another state, do you intend to partner with the international community in terms of ensuring prosecution is had?
Yes, we have, in fact, some computer experts have offered programs to trace the disposal of assets. Nowadays, when people try to move money around the world, it is not as difficult as before to find out where the instruments have been used to send money from place to place. So we are getting some advice, some information, and we expect that in the fullness of time, we'll be able to track most of the money which has been illegally removed from the state coffers, legally spent money. But we have sought international assistance, you're quite right.
Ms. Motilal from NCN.
I'd like to take you back to the mention of it's only been 100 days and the 100 days plan. There were many expectations of some amount of movement on the value-added tax, one of the most important for the consuming public. And you mentioned talks have begun on the 2016 budget, and there is a tax reform committee.
Mm-hmm.
Can we expect some amount of work from that committee to show up in the 2016 budget?
Well, the finance minister has very ambitiously promised in 2016 there'll be 2 budgets, which means that we'll not only get the 2016 budget, but we'll get a 2017 budget before the end of FY 2016. Very ambitious, and I'm confident that he's going to make it. So I intend to go to Parliament in January to lay out what will be our agenda, our legislative agenda for 2016. And that will lead into the budget, which I'm very sure will be presented before the deadline at the end of March.
And the work of the tax reform committee?
Well, I'm not quite sure what deadline they will have, but we will be able to get at least an interim report from that committee before the 2016 budget is prepared. So right now, I would say we are about 7 months away from the deadline for the 2016, but we can get sufficient information from the tax reform committee before the budget is prepared to bring about the changes that we want in the fiscal changes that we want.
Travis, yes, your turn.
Mr. President, you have written and spoken quite extensively on crime and security in this country. I want to take a look at the Psychotropic Substances Act. I think that's the act which prohibits the magistracy from extending leniency to juveniles who are caught with very small amounts of illicit drugs. Now, that is chiefly responsible for the overcrowding of our prisons. And you said that 75% of our youths are in prison. What consideration has your administration given to revisiting this act?
Well, within 10 days of my being sworn in as president, you do know that I released about 56 youngsters for non-violent crimes and non-cocaine events. People who stole cell phones and small amounts of marijuana. I said they'd be better off at school than in jail. Some of them are quite young, 20, 21 years old. Yes, I don't believe that personally, it is not something that the cabinet has ruled on, and I always consult cabinet. I don't believe that personally people should be given custodial sentences for small amounts of marijuana. Cocaine is different, but I could never accept that a mother of children would be separated and put in jail for small amounts of marijuana. So the law will have to be changed, and we're going to be working on that in 2016. But it is, you're right, it's a contributory factor to overcrowding, and I've used my discretion to grant amnesty to particularly young persons and women who have been convicted for what I would call misdemeanors. So we're going to ease up the pressure, you know, maybe 50 or 60 at a time. More will be coming at Christmas. Some of them will be home for Christmas.
Thank you, sir.
I'm assuming you have a follow-up? No?
Yearly. Yearly, sir?
Every independence, definitely. Christmas, maybe. Independence, yes. Independence means freedom.
Thank you.
Kiana, we can come back to you for now.
Thank you. Mr. President, could you share with us your thoughts on the illegal movement of cash and gold and narcotics across our borders, what your government has implemented thus far in measures in preventing this or tackling this? And could you say if you're worried about the recent gold smuggling racket that was dismantled and what this says about corruption in Guyana?
Well, I don't think gold smuggling is recent. Perhaps the discovery is recent, but it has been taking place for several years. It is one of the means of laundering money, and it is very difficult to prevent it from occurring. And what we are doing now in terms of enforcement is, of course, tightening up the controls on our borders, but there also needs to be a second look at the tax regime. If people feel that they can smuggle gold into other countries and maybe pay lower tariffs or lower royalties, they will do so. But once we modify our royalties and our taxation, maybe more people will be encouraged to declare it locally. Those who smuggle gold into more, I would say, lawful jurisdictions are likely to get caught and are severely punished. So many of them don't actually try to smuggle into places like the United States or United Kingdom. But to the extent that that happens, we are going to try to establish bilateral agreements so that anybody who's discovered, will be reported to our jurisdiction and they'll be duly punished. So one is changing the law to ensure that there is greater flexibility in the fiscal measures, that is for royalties, and second is improving law enforcement and also the quality of the civil service. I mentioned before that we are going to set up later this year a public service staff college, and I do hope to train over the next 5 years a new breed of unbribable civil servants, people who are going to be better educated, better remunerated, and better supervised. I really feel that a stronger public service will be able to avoid some of the criticisms that we've had with graft and corruption. But something needs to be done in the public service. It wouldn't just happen simply by passing more laws. The Guyana's laws are pretty comprehensive. What we need is a body of law enforcement officers in forestry, in mining, in counter-narcotics, in police force, who enforce those laws. And it's the human factor that is giving us problems, or the human factor. And I hope that the Public Service Staff College will produce a generation of public servants who are honest and efficient.
At this time, the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana will take just about 2 more questions before we have to wrap up today's program of the public interest, and I'll begin with Rada.
Time really flew. Huh?
I have to ask this one as an active member of the media. The Prime Minister's office is exploring this idea of a policy for the local media. Could you say whether, in your view, there is actually a need for such, and what exactly would you like to see come out in such a policy?
There's a dichotomy here, and I do believe that because of the size of the country, the complexity of Guyanese society, you need a public information system. And I would support a policy for the public information system. Many countries have similar systems, but you must realize that many of the media houses are based on the coastline or in Georgetown itself. So if something occurs at Carasabai, something occurs at the Wariwanao, something occurs at Maruka, many of the private media houses cannot cover those events. So if there's a disaster, if there's maybe a threat of a flood or there's an air crash, many of the private media cannot know until they're told that. So we need a public information system which provides public information in emergencies in order to prevent disasters or to prevent the worsening of a disaster. That is in a separate category. So I agree with the Prime Minister that there needs to be some means by which the government can inform the public about matters of national interest, matters of importance. It could be Venezuela or something. So that is one system. The private media should regulate it. I see the private media as being professional. I spoke to the members of the media in our community here, and I told them that what I want to see from them is professionalism. That is, they must have knowledge, they must study their profession, they must master their profession. I don't want them to be quacks. I don't want them to pretend to behave in a way which they're not trained or educated to do. They must have a social responsibility. That is, they are responsible for speaking the truth to the public. I don't want them to lie. I don't care who they're working for. I don't want a reporter to tell lies, tell untruths. And the third thing is I want to see the press as a community regulating itself. In other words, if a reporter misbehaves or deliberately publishes falsehoods, I expect his or her peers to, particularly through the Guyana Press Association, to sanction that reporter. So I see two branches of the communications system. One is the public information system, and this is what I believe the Prime Minister was speaking about, and he's correct, and I support him, that we have an obligation to report what the government is doing simply because the private media cannot cover the country as a whole. And on the second hand, I have no intention of regulating the private media. There must be sanctions to the law. If they liable or commit any breach of the law, well, they will face the law. But as far as I'm concerned, it is largely a self-regulatory body. The state is different, but the private media must regulate themselves, and they're free. I believe in media freedom, I believe in press freedom. And I don't believe that what the Prime Minister said should be misconstrued. So let's look at them as two separate forms of public information.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. In the essence of time, I know the journalist from Nightly News, Travis Chase, has agreed to defer his question to another viewing when he will appear again on the public interest. This has been another edition of the Public Interest. I'd like to thank the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, His Excellency, Brigadier David Granger. I'd also like to thank the other members of the panel, the journalist from the National Communications Network, NCN, Ms. Radha Motilal, journalist from Kaitor News, Ms. Kiana Wilberg, and of course, journalist from Nightly News, Travis Chase. Thank you to you at home for watching, and do join us again next time. I'm Malika Ramsey. Goodbye.